He didn't come to win. He came with $3,000, and a heart full of memories. But when the bidding for his father's squad car soared past 50 grand, he thought it was over. What happened next silenced the entire room, not with applause, but with something far deeper. This is the true story of a young man, the son of a deputy who was killed in the line of duty, and the quiet stranger who changed everything, without saying a single word. Before we dive in, tell me where you're listening from, and what's the most moving story you've ever heard? Welcome to Grateful Stories, where tales of compassion and kindness are told. Let's uncover what really happened. Tanner Brownlee sat cross-legged on the worn hardwood floor of the living room, a cardboard box in front of him, its edges taped and retaped over the years. Light poured through the half-drawn blinds of the small house in Greeley, Colorado, throwing golden lines across the floor. He didn't rush to open the box. He just stared at it, his fingers resting lightly on the lid, as if disturbing the silence too quickly might break something he couldn't fix. Inside were things he already knew by heart: his father's badge, dulled but still weighty, a cracked leather wallet, a folded American flag, and two spare nameplates engraved Deputy S. Brownlee. But beneath it all, wrapped in tissue paper, yellowed by time, was a photo of his dad standing next to his old squad car, a black Dodge Charger with scuff marks along the bumper and a light bar that Tanner used to think looked like a crown. His throat tightened. It had been 5 years since his father was killed in the line of duty shot during a chaotic foot pursuit that ended behind a warehouse near the edge of town. Sam Brownlee had been a deputy with the Weld County Sheriff's Office for nearly a decade. He wasn't perfect. He worked too much, left laundry half done, and always forgot where the remote was. But to Tanner, he was solid. He was safe. Tanner was 16 when the knock came at the door. 2 uniforms, 2 silent faces, and then the sound of his mother sobbing from somewhere far away. Even though she was right in front of him, life hadn't felt steady since. He had dropped out of college his freshman year, not because he wasn't capable, but because someone needed to keep the lights on, and someone needed to help with his little brother. Their mother, Michelle, had taken a leave from the hospital where she worked as a nurse, but grief is not something anyone clocks in and out of. For a long while, the house was a place of shadows and closed doors, but somehow they got through. Not with grand solutions, just routines. Late-night drives when no one could sleep. Microwave dinners. Quiet mornings where no one spoke unless they had to. And always, the picture of Sam in uniform above the fireplace. Unsmiling, but not stern. Just there. Tanner hadn't seen the Charger since the funeral. The department had retired it and stored it away. No longer fit for patrol, it was just a car, 4 wheels and a radio. But when he saw a post online that the Dodge Charger was being put up for public auction to raise money for a fallen officer's charity, something shifted inside him, sharp and immediate. He reread the post 3 times. The auction would be held in 2 weeks. The starting price wasn't listed yet, but the car was expected to sell between $8,000 and $12,000. He closed his laptop and stared at the ceiling. That car had been with his father on patrol more days than not. It was the last vehicle he ever drove. It had been part of their family's rhythm. Now it was just up for grabs. He had $600 in his checking account. That wouldn't even buy the tires. But giving up without trying felt wrong. So he did what he had never done before. He made a GoFundMe page. He stared at the blank description box for an hour before typing anything. It felt awkward asking for money, but this wasn't about collecting things. It was about connection, so he wrote what was true. Hi, my name's Tanner. My dad, Deputy Sam Brownlee, was killed in the line of duty when I was 16. His squad car is being auctioned soon, and I'd like to buy it not because it's shiny or rare, but because it was a part of him. I want to keep it in the family, not see it end up on some stranger's lot. Anything helps. Thank you for reading. He uploaded a picture of Sam standing next to the car, hands on his hips, squinting in the sun. Then he shared the link first with old friends from high school, then with a few local Facebook groups, and finally on a subreddit for children of fallen officers. At first, nothing happened. A few shares, a handful of likes. Then a $20 donation appeared, then $5, then $50 from someone in Idaho who wrote, "Your dad was a hero. I never met him, but I lost my brother in blue the same year. Hope you get that car." Tanner blinked hard and whispered, "Thank you," to no one. Over the next week, the fundraiser climbed steadily. His goal was $12,500, the Kelley Blue Book estimate, for the vehicle's top condition. In reality, he knew the Charger was worn, had over 147,000 miles, and probably needed brake work, but none of that mattered. He raised $1,800 in 3 days, then $2,600 by the weekend. On the 6th day, someone from New Mexico donated $500 anonymously, pushing the total to just over $3,000. Still far from the goal, but enough for hope. Michelle watched him with careful eyes. She didn't say much. She didn't need to. One night, she left a folded $100 bill on the kitchen table with a sticky note. "For your dad's car. I think he'd want you to try." Tanner knew she didn't have it to spare. He tucked it into the box with the badge and nameplates. The night before the auction, Tanner couldn't sleep. He sat in the garage, going over strategies in his head. He'd never bid on anything before. He didn't know how fast things moved, how aggressive people got. He'd read tips online: don't raise your hand too quickly, watch how others play, know your ceiling and stick to it. But that last part was the problem. His ceiling was $3 and $4.65. His heart didn't have one. He imagined some wealthy collector winning the car and repainting it, or stripping it for parts, or worse, using it as a novelty, a prop. It was just metal, he reminded himself. Just metal and bolts. But the thought still made his stomach turn. That night, he reread the comments on his fundraiser. One stood out: if you don't win, don't let it define the loss. What matters isn't the car. It's what it stood for, and that's already in you. He stared at those words until they blurred. Then he closed the laptop and went to bed, heart pounding beneath his ribs. Tomorrow, he would stand in that auction room, not just as a bidder, but as a son chasing the last thing that felt like home. And he didn't know yet that someone else, someone he'd never met, had already read his story and made a silent decision to make sure Tanner never had to lose that car a second time. The morning of the auction arrived with skies the color of damp slate and a wind that wouldn't settle. Tanner dressed quietly, choosing his father's old department jacket, slightly oversized, frayed at the collar, and still smelling faintly of cedar and leather. It wasn't meant to be a statement. It was a memory stitched into fabric. Michelle stood by the kitchen window, sipping weak coffee from a chipped mug. She didn't ask if he was ready. She just gave a small nod when he looked at her. Tanner pocketed the folded donation money, zipped up his coat, and they drove off in silence. The event was being held at the county fairgrounds in a long, low building usually reserved for livestock shows and antique tractors. But today, it had been cleaned, draped in banners from the Fallen Officers Foundation, and filled with rows of folding chairs and long tables showcasing auction items, memorabilia, police equipment, and vehicles, including the Dodge Charger. It stood under a halogen spotlight at the far end of the room, clean but unpolished, like a soldier standing at parade rest. The light caught the scratches on the bumper, the faded black paint, the narrow dents on the side door. Every imperfection told a story Tanner already knew by heart. He stood back from the crowd, watching people mill around. Some wore badges. Others looked like collectors. There was chatter, low and constant. The smell of old metal and cafeteria coffee lingered in the air. The auctioneer, a thin man in a dark vest with a mic strapped to his face, tapped the stand twice. "Folks, we appreciate you being here today," he said. "Let's get started." Tanner's palms were already sweating. He had gone over it in his head 100 times. Wait for the first few bids, then raise your number calmly. Don't look nervous. Don't show how much it matters. The auctioneer's voice shifted into rhythm, fast, clipped, mechanical. "We'll open the bid at $2,500. Who'll give me 25A paddle went up immediately. Then another. Tanner waited. 3,000. 35. 4,000. He raised his hand. 5,000 from the young man near the center. The auctioneer barked. 5,000 on the table. Michelle touched his arm gently. He didn't look at her. He was staring at the car. 6,000. 7. 8. 9. 10,000 now. 10,5. 11. The numbers were climbing too fast. Tanner felt it like pressure against his chest. 12,5. 13. 14,5. 15. His hand dropped to his side. He couldn't go higher. Not without bluffing. Not without money he didn't have. 17,5. 18. 19,5. A man 2 rows ahead, mid-50s, broad shoulders, a denim work jacket. He hadn't spoken a word, just raised his paddle with calm precision. Every time someone called a number, he added 500. Tanner clenched his jaw. That man wasn't hesitating. Was he even looking at the car or just bidding for sport? 21, 23, 26. The number punched through the room like a sharp intake of breath. Tanner's heart started to sink. A ripple of murmurs swept through the crowd. 30,000, the auctioneer shouted, grinning. We're not done yet. Michelle leaned in. Tanner, she whispered. It's okay. He didn't answer. He couldn't. The charger now belonged to the room, to whoever had the deepest pockets, not the deepest memories. And that hurt more than he'd expected. 35, 37.5, 40. A pause. Then the denim jacket man raised his paddle again. 42, 44, 47, 50,000. Folks. Tanner stared at the number cards, at the sea of strangers, at the car that had once carried his father's laughter, his voice over the radio, his silence during tough nights. Now it was an object auctioned for spectacle. 55. Tanner's breath caught. The man was still bidding. 57.5. 60,000. The gavel came down hard. Sold. A scattered applause broke out. Tanner didn't move. Michelle pressed her fingers into his hand. You did everything you could, she said softly. Her voice was steady, but her eyes shimmered. He nodded once and stood. His legs felt heavy. As he turned toward the exit, a sudden voice behind the mic interrupted. Mr. Wells, sir, the auctioneer said, if you'll step forward to claim your vehicle. Tanner paused. The name meant nothing to him. He kept walking, weaving between chairs and conversations. Then he heard footsteps catching up behind them. Hey, son. Tanner turned. It was the man in the denim jacket, thick gray stubble on his chin, eyes dark but kind, a set of keys dangling from his fingers. Tanner blinked, confused. I believe this belongs to you, the man said, holding the keys out, gently. Michelle froze. Tanner didn't move. What? He breathed. The man smiled. My name's Steve Wells. I run a farm just east of here. I read about your story a few days ago. You didn't have to win today. I just wanted to make sure your dad's car stayed where it belongs. Tanner's hand trembled as he reached out and took the keys. His mouth opened, but no sound came. Steve didn't wait for thanks. He simply tipped his head, then turned and walked back toward the crowd. A silence spread around them, wider than the applause had been. Tanner looked down at the keys. The fob was cracked. A tag still hung from the ring. Unit number 112, retired. He turned toward the charger slowly. It hadn't changed. Still old, still imperfect, still his father's. Michelle's hand tightened around his arm. Go on, she whispered. He walked toward the car, step by step, breath by breath. The door creaked when he opened it. The seat was rough with age. He slid behind the wheel and shut the door. Outside, the voices faded. Inside, it was quiet, familiar, like coming home. His fingers brushed over the steering wheel, then reached for the radio dial. Instinct, not thought. He didn't cry. Not then. Not yet. but he let out a long breath and whispered one word. Dad. Steve Wells didn't like crowds. Never had. Even as a boy. He'd always stood back during county fairs or family reunions, watching more than talking. That morning, as he parked his dusty pickup truck in the lot behind the fairground auction, he took a slow breath and stayed inside for a minute longer than necessary. The sky had turned bright since dawn, and the wind had quieted, but something inside him felt heavy. Not regret, not nerves, just weight like carrying something that wasn't fully his. He stepped out, straightened the collar of his denim jacket, and walked inside. No one paid much attention to him. They rarely did. He looked like any other rancher in Colorado weathered hands. Squinting eyes, the faint scent of hay clinging to his boots. But inside, Steve carried a scar that no one could see. When Steve was 20, he lost his best friend in a traffic stop gone wrong. Deputy Rick Halverson had just joined the force 2 months into his badge when he was gunned down during what should have been a routine citation. Steve never forgot the sound of Rick's mom on the phone that night. He never forgot how the town moved on. But the family didn't. He hadn't joined the department himself. His path led to cattle, acreage, and early mornings, but he never forgot the silence that followed a folded flag. In the years after Rick's death, Steve began donating quietly to foundations that supported families of fallen officers. No social media posts, no checks with names, just quiet acts, year after year, because grief doesn't expire. So when Steve's cousin sent him a news article about a young man named Sam Brownlee trying to buy back his father's old squad car, something inside him clicked hard. The story wasn't flashy, no headlines, just a GoFundMe page and a photograph of a teenager trying to hold on to a piece of someone lost. Steve read it twice, then a third time. Then, without telling his wife or ranch foreman, he marked the auction date on the back of a feed invoice. That was 5 days ago. He didn't call ahead, didn't reach out to the family. He simply made up his mind that car wasn't going to belong to anyone but that boy. As the bidding escalated, Steve kept his eyes on the stage. The young man Tanner sat near the middle row, shoulders tense, hands gripping his chair. The woman beside him must have been his mother. Steve watched them carefully. Every time the number rose, Tanner sank a little deeper into his seat. Steve didn't raise his paddle to win. He raised it to protect. He had expected the price to climb. Auction fever always did that. But when it passed 50,000, there was a murmur in the crowd. Some people looked around, confused. Others chuckled, assuming it was some eccentric collector showing off. Steve didn't care. He wasn't buying a car. He was keeping a promise. When the gavel slammed down and the auctioneer called his name, Steve nodded once, then stepped toward the stage. He didn't wave, didn't smile, just walked. The boy had already stood up, eyes hollow, ready to leave. Steve's boots echoed against the polished concrete floor as he caught up to them. "Hey," he said gently. "Son." Tanner turned. The keys in Steve's hand felt warm from his grip. He didn't hold them out immediately. He looked the boy in the eye. First really looked and saw the mix of confusion, pain, and pride there. He saw something else, too restraint. This was a young man used to holding himself together. "I believe this belongs to you," Steve said. The words hung in the air for a long second. Then two, Michelle took in a sharp breath. Tanner stared, and then, slowly, he took the keys. There was no cheer, no dramatic gasps, just a soft ripple of awe like a gust of wind had passed through the room and left it still. Around them, people stopped whispering. Conversations faded. No one clapped. No one reached for their phones. They simply watched as a stranger gave away $60,000 and didn't ask for anything in return. Steve turned and walked back toward the exit. He didn't look back. He hated attention. Always had. But more than that, he believed some things didn't need spotlights. Some kindness should live quiet. Outside. He lit a cigarette with trembling fingers and exhaled slowly toward the sky. He hadn't smoked in years, but today it felt earned. Back inside, Tanner stood frozen beside the charger. He didn't sit in it right away. Instead, he ran his hand along the edge of the roof, then opened the back door. The seat was stiff with age. A stack of old service logs still sat in the compartment. Behind the passenger seat, records his father had likely filled out in quick, practiced handwriting. Tanner opened the driver's door and sat down. He closed his eyes, breathed in the scent of vinyl and faded cologne, and gripped the wheel like it was something alive. Steve's voice echoed in his mind, simple, quiet. "I just wanted to make sure your dad's car stayed where it belongs." He didn't cry, not yet, but his throat burned with a kind of gratitude that words couldn't carry. Back near the registration booth, a volunteer leaned toward the auctioneer. "Do you know that man?" she whispered. The auctioneer shook his head. "Nope, never seen him before." Another woman added, "That was something else." The auctioneer didn't reply. He just looked toward the door where Steve had exited, then back at the Charger where Tanner now sat still, silent, hand pressed over the badge number carved into the dashboard. Later that day, long after most people had gone, Tanner and Michelle remained in the parking lot. He sat behind the wheel while she leaned against the passenger door. Neither of them spoke for a while. Michelle finally said, "Your father would have been proud of how you handled today." Tanner nodded slowly. "I almost gave up." She smiled. "You didn't, and that man didn't either." He looked down at the keys in his lap. The tag still read, "Retired," but to him, it wasn't just about the car's years of service. It was about legacy passed through hands not by blood, but by grace. He glanced at the rearview mirror, then at the road stretching beyond the auction lot. He wasn't sure where he was going yet, but for the first time in a long while, he felt ready to move forward. And somewhere, a rancher in a dusty jacket was driving back to his fields. The radio low, the windows down, and the sun beginning to dip over the Weld County hills. No spotlight, no headlines. Just the quiet satisfaction of doing the right thing and never needing to be thanked for it. The Charger sat beneath the carport behind Tanner's house, its black frame gleaming under the pale Colorado sun. It was no longer just a vehicle. It was a promise, kept and polished. Every weekend, Tanner took time to clean it by hand, not out of habit, but reverence. He replaced the old windshield wipers, buffed out the faded lettering on the rear bumper, and reattached the original unit tag Unit 1112. The car still had quirks. The engine needed a firm turn to start. The radio crackled at random. The right rear window stuck halfway. But Tanner didn't fix those things. Some imperfections, he thought, were like fingerprints, proof of presence. On the dashboard, he added a plaque, Deputy Sam Brownlee, end of watch, May 2010. Next to it, he placed his father's badge, secured in a leather backing, just within reach. Life didn't change overnight. There were still bills to pay, still shifts at the feed store, but something shifted in the quiet. The grief that used to sit like stone now felt like something he could carry without crumbling. A month after the auction, Tanner signed up as a volunteer with the Fallen Officers Foundation, the same one that had helped his family during their worst days. Now, he stood on the other side of the table answering calls, organizing care packages, helping with paperwork for survivor benefits. At first, it felt strange, as if he didn't belong. But every time a trembling voice on the other end of the line asked, "How do I even begin?" he understood why he was there. He didn't have all the answers, but he knew what it felt like to lose everything and still show up the next day. Michelle saw it too. Her son had grown into something steady, not hardened, but rooted. One Saturday morning, Tanner asked if she wanted to take a drive. She hesitated at first. The Charger had been parked for weeks. She hadn't sat in it since Sam last drove it, but she nodded quietly and followed him outside. They drove slowly through the northeast side of town, past the school where Sam used to patrol during morning drop-offs, past the gas station where he once stopped to help an elderly man change a flat. Michelle looked out the window. Her hands were folded in her lap, eyes distant but calm. At a red light, she turned to Tanner. "This is strange," she said, "but It doesn't hurt like I thought it would. Tanner didn't speak. He just reached over and squeezed her hand gently. Later that afternoon, they pulled into the small cemetery just off Route 34. Tanner parked beside the headstone, then opened the trunk. He carried a small bouquet of fresh sunflowers and placed them carefully beneath his father's name. I still talk to him sometimes, Tanner admitted, usually when I'm driving. Michelle gave a half smile. He always liked road conversations. As they stood there in silence, the breeze stirred the grass and rustled the leaves overhead. It didn't feel like a goodbye, just another visit. Tanner didn't try to fill the silence. Some connections didn't need words. Weeks turned into months, and slowly, stories about the Charger began to surface online. People shared photos, remembering Sam, remembering the boy who tried to buy his father's car and the stranger who gave it to him. One day, Tanner received a handwritten letter in the mail. No return address. You don't know me, but I served with your father once. He was the kind of man who'd give you his last bottle of water on patrol. I'm glad the car found its way back to you. He'd be proud. Keep going. Tanner folded the letter and slipped it into the glove compartment. Next to a growing collection of small mementos, his father's old shift roster, a photo of him as a child wearing Sam's hat, and a crumpled ticket stub from the auction. He started driving the car more often, not just for errands, but for meaning. He took it to community events, to charity runs, even once to a high school career day. The students didn't recognize him, but they stared at the car, asked questions, listened. At one event, a small boy in a plastic badge costume tugged on Tanner's sleeve and asked, "Was this really a real police car?" Tanner nodded. "The realest one I've ever known." He didn't say more. He didn't need to. As seasons changed, Tanner kept driving, through rain and snow, sunrise and twilight. He'd roll down the window and listen to the wind. Some nights, he parked on quiet country roads and just sat. No destination, just movement. It wasn't about holding on to the past. It was about honoring where it had led him. The Charger had been his father's partner, his shield. Now, it was his. And one day, he hoped it would belong to his child, along with the story of a man who wore a badge, not for glory, but for good. One morning, Tanner pulled into a small parking lot across from an elementary school. The bell hadn't rung yet. Children spilled onto the playground, backpacks bouncing, voices carrying in the cool air. He sat in the driver's seat for a while, watching them. Some played tag. Others laughed at nothing at all. A few clung to their parents at the gate, reluctant to say goodbye. Tanner smiled faintly. He reached out and rested his hand on the steering wheel, fingers brushing over the old leather wrap. His reflection in the mirror looked a little older than it should have, but steadier. The Charger sat quietly beneath the shade of a maple tree, its engine off, but its presence undeniable. Tanner leaned forward, gaze fixed on the playground. He thought of his father, of Steve Wells, of all the people who had carried pieces of him through their own pain. And then, softly, almost like a whisper meant only for the wind, he spoke. "I'll tell your grandson about you someday, Dad." Then he leaned back and listened to the laughter beyond the glass. Because some journeys don't end when the road runs out. Some simply turn into stories waiting to be passed on.